Thresholds of the Unseen, Part 1. By Elton Gar. Being on the bridge of any starship was still exciting for Deks, who had grown up on a world where the only Alliance ships he saw were cargo ships. It was doubly exciting because it was built around his designs, though that excitement was tempered by the other 18 people on the ship. He had called the design a skimmer ship. Deks had explained its function repeatedly, with more focus on technical details than why it mattered to the crew, who were only focused on surviving the anomaly that was approaching Alliance territory. It had been named the Eclipse Runner. Deks had to look up what an eclipse was when he had heard the name, since Itris 4 didn't really have anything like that. He had almost asked them to change the name because it was irrelevant to the ship's function. They should name it something that made it more obvious what it did, but when he saw the ship, he decided he didn't care. The ship was, above everything else, a work of art, one that was smaller than almost any ship in the fleet and built faster. But it was every bit Deks' vision, with every curve designed to reinforce the structural integrity of every other part, so that the ship was nearly indestructible. And art was important to Deks even if he didn't always see it the same way other people did. It was still a connection to home. Every planet had its own personality. Some, like Earth and Trondon, were war planets, others were farming worlds or industrial planets. Itris was a world founded by artists, philosophers, and farmers, a world that, due to quirks of gravity, was at the far end of the gateway system and a dozen jumps away from any other habitable world. The captain glanced at Deks. He was a fumer, shorter and wider than a human, with huge eyes and long fingers. Not being human, the many facial expressions and tones that Deks had memorized were less useful. But he would adapt and learn. The captain was nicknamed Brett. Deks didn't usually use nicknames, but the fumer language was all but impossible for other races to use, since it made extensive use of the odd air sacs in the fumer's throat, so he called him Captain. Brett was wildly overqualified for a ship this size, but the mission was important.
Is she ready to fly?
Brett asked, glancing at Deks.
Everything should be working,
Deks said. He was an engineer, not a mechanic or a pilot. Yet everyone looked to him for everything about the ship.
Take it out then,
the captain said. The ship seemed to wobble as the clamps that held it released, and then the pilot pushed the small lever forward. Deks, as the only one on the bridge not sitting down, was knocked off his feet as the ship shot forward.
This thing has some power,
the pilot said, but she didn't pull back the speed.
Its engine has the same thrust as the ones we use in the capital ships,
Brett said, glancing at Deks. The size of the engine was one of the reasons the crew was so small.
The original design was to fly into stars. If you don't want to stay there permanently, you want to make sure that the engine has enough thrust to get you out,
Deks said. He had designed the skimmer before he had known about the anomaly. The silence once again reminded Deks that he wasn't part of the command structure of the crew. He was the only civilian, and only here because no one understood the Eclipse Runner the way he did. After a few minutes, the pilot nudged the thrust up another notch, but this time Deks was expecting it and didn't fall.
With this type of thrust, we won't even need a gateway,
the pilot said.
It's 48 light years to our target. If we had the fuel, we could reach half-light speed by the midpoint. So it would take roughly 130 years to reach our destination,
Deks said. The glance from the pilot suggested that her statement had probably been hyperbole, but Deks hadn't always been great at reading people. That was one of the reasons that he had focused on machines when everyone else was pushing him towards art.
I think your math may be off. The entire reason for this trip is that the anomaly is moving towards us. So we wouldn't have to cross all 48 light years,
the captain said, expertly taking some of the social pressure off Deks. He had done that a few times.
Either way, we should use the gateways,
the pilot said. She also seemed more relaxed.
And we might as well start that way now. We have 38 jumps,
the captain said. Each of the jumps took about 4 hours, as even outside of the typical laws of the universe, crossing light years took time. And after the second, people began to scatter across the ship. Not that there was much room to scatter. There was the engine room, which took up the bulk of the ship, and the crew quarters. 10 rooms for 19 crew, with only the captain and Deks having private quarters, though calling Deks room quarters was being generous. It was more of a large box with a bed in it. But it had a computer monitor, and was more comfortable than being around the crew most of the time, so Deks spent much of his time there. Because of that, he still didn't know most of the crew's names when they passed through the last gateway. It was a much rougher ride than the others, because being outside of the gateway network, it didn't have the stabilization. The lights in the Eclipse flickered, and there was a distinct smell of something plastic burning. Deks noted that, but didn't try to do anything about it as he went to the bridge, reaching it as the crew finished deploying the small temporary gateway that would be their way home. You couldn't actually see the anomaly. It absorbed everything that struck it, including light and even cosmic background radiation. But if you knew what you were looking for, you could see the lack of light and stars. The Eclipse stopped for the first time in days as the ship's mechanics prepared it for the next part of its journey. But the truth was that they had no idea if Deks' design would work because no one in the Alliance had been able to figure out what the anomaly was. Everyone in the crew knew that. It was why this trip had been entirely crewed by volunteers. But there was no turning back now. So once they had lowered the metal reinforcements over all the windows and engaged the structural stabilizers that had been built into everything, they began to move forward. The ship crawled forward, taking almost as long to approach the anomaly as it had to cross through the gates. That was, in part, because there was no way to know where the edge of the anomaly was. All they could do was guess based on the amount of information they weren't getting. Even seeing everything only through the cameras, the blackness was oppressive. It was as if the entire universe had been swallowed by something that they were recklessly moving towards. Each hour they would send out another probe and try to measure where it disappeared. But it never seemed consistent. And then everything went black. All the power in the ship stopped working. Even the emergency lights and the flashlights had stopped working. This had always been a possibility. If the anomaly simply snuffed out energy, then there wouldn't be anything they could do. But Deks wasn't worried as he heard people begin to talk. Didn't they understand? Sound was a type of energy, as were the signals in the brain. If the anomaly had actually snuffed everything out, they'd already be dead. That thought would have helped more if the life support had kept working. But the ship quickly began to cool, and even in the darkest blackness Deks had ever seen, someone was able to get an emergency blanket into his hand.
Don't worry. It will come back on,
Deks said, trying to convince himself as much as anyone else. There were built-in emergency systems that should restart everything. The problem was that most of those used computers. And if everything on the Eclipse had been based entirely on Deks' design, that would have been the end. The crew would have frozen to death. But every Alliance ship had failsafes that assumed complete energy failures. A small tube filled with a liquid that broke when it got too cold that should trigger a system restart. So as he huddled in the corner, the blanket pulled up over his head, there was a small hum, and then the emergency lights of the ship flickered on. They were far duller than they should be, but the lights weren't what was important. The small amount of heat was. People checked sensors, but almost nothing was working. And the captain said,
"Your ship held up better than I expected."
Deks had never even considered that the ship might actually fail. The energy could be drained or the crew could die, but the ship would be fine. But now that someone mentioned it to him, he wondered. He had designed the ship to be almost unbreakable, with every curve designed to spread out any impact or pressure to the entire ship, and with struts and supports that reinforced all of it. But it was impossible to make something entirely indestructible. It seemed to be an offhanded comment, and the captain moved on.
"Can someone get me a view screen? Or some information on something? Or at least open a window?"
Deks almost told them not to open a window. They were in space, but more than that, the ship was designed to be stronger when the shutters were closed. But before he spoke, he realized that it was likely just one of the things people said that wasn't meant to make any sense. Instead, he moved over to one of the consoles no one was at. Unlike the rest of the crew, he knew every station, even if he wasn't as proficient at any specific station as people whose job it was to focus on that one thing. The readings made no sense. The most important was that the hull of the ship was warm. Not hot, like they had went into a sun, though it was designed to be able to absorb even that much heat, but warm. And not just from one direction. It was as if the area they were in was warm. There were other strange readings as well, and he said,
"Captain, I think there might be an atmosphere. It's thin, certainly not enough to breathe in, but it shouldn't be here at all."
He's right. It makes no sense, but there are gases of some type and a significant amount of heat.
Bethany said. She was the only other person on the ship whose only job was science. She was an astrophysicist, and they hoped once inside, she could figure out what the anomaly was. But this was outside of anyone's expertise.
Can anyone explain how something that's bigger than most solar systems could have any type of atmosphere?
It's been absorbing everything that comes near it for at least 100 years, including light,
the pilot said. That didn't actually explain much, but Deks suspected she was leading them down a track. And once he stopped focusing entirely on what she said and tried to imagine what she was implying, it became a bit easier.
It would require some type of matter converter, and one at a massive scale,
Deks said, trying to follow the lead of the others and not fully explain. He wondered if perhaps over-explaining things upset people here, as much as spending hours discussing engineering tended to upset the artists on his own world.
Matter-energy conversion is impossible,
one of the others said.
No, it just requires amounts of energy that are inconceivable. But with fusion and a practically unlimited amount of matter and time, you could do it,
Bethany said.
So you're suggesting that this is some type of a weapon created by a powerful race?
The captain said.
Why would you make a weapon that created atmosphere in space?
Deks said, then realized that it was probably a bad idea to disagree with the captain.
Because it's not a weapon. It's a habitat at a scale that I never even conceived of,
Bethany said.
You mean a space station like the Capitol but bigger?
The captain said. The capital of the Alliance was the largest manufactured structure in the galaxy, so far as anyone knew. It was a space station that had been growing steadily since the founding of the Alliance, and had grown big enough that it had its own gravity and atmosphere.
Not exactly, but I think that there is likely something impressive at the center of the anomaly. Something that isn't a naturally occurring phenomenon,
Bethany said.
Let's go find out. Can someone get me some thrust?
The captain said. With the immediate danger over, things slowed down somewhat. They checked the ship carefully to make sure it was safe to engage the engines. Deks wanted to tell them there was no point. The engines couldn't put out enough power to hurt the ship, even if it was partially compromised, but they would have checked anyway. And he wouldn't have disagreed. He loved checklists. The ship was fine, and they began with minimum thrusters. Moving through even a light atmosphere was unusual for a spaceship, but the Eclipse had been designed to fly into suns, so a thin atmosphere wasn't a problem. And then they did open the windows. Not the glass, of course, even with a light atmosphere that would be suicide, but they carefully removed the metal that had covered it so they could see out. It was odd. Typically in space you could see basically forever, but with even a light atmosphere, it created a wall of swirling blue, white, and green. Those colors didn't mean it was the same type of atmosphere as on planets humans lived on, only that the refraction was similar. But while Deks was focused on the engineering and the limitations that it caused, the others acted more like the artists on Itris.
It's beautiful,
Bethany said, and several others agreed. Deks didn't see it. He understood that the shade of blue was one that humans had evolved to appreciate, but it had never appealed to him the same way.
It's going to make traveling slow since we can't see,
Deks said.
Do you have somewhere to be?
The captain asked.
I am scheduled to be served lunch in 40 minutes, and my scheduled sleep time is in 2 hours,
Deks said. He wasn't sure why that mattered, but the captain wouldn't have asked if he didn't have a reason.
I meant that speed isn't of paramount importance. You can enjoy the moment,
the captain said. Unlike humans, he never seemed to get upset when Deks didn't understand. Perhaps his people were more comfortable with that than humans.
If our calculations are correct, and this is bigger than some solar systems, at current speed, we will reach the center in about 100 years,
Deks said. The captain glanced at Bethany, who said,
I can't do the math that fast, but it sounds right.
Well then, perhaps speed is paramount,
the captain said, reflecting on the formidable stretch of time that lay before them. The crew's concern was palpable, the daunting reality of their prolonged journey weighing heavily in the silence that followed. Author's note:
I'll keep this short. This story was too long for a single video, and so I split it into 3. The reason it went that long is because I was enjoying both the mystery and exploration, and because I liked Deks. I hope you did as well. If you're watching this immediately after it comes out, it will be a couple of days before part 2 comes out. If you're watching after that, the link to the next part should be on the screen. You can also sign up for my newsletter and get a free story every week at sci-fi.com, or get access to over 30 patron-exclusive stories at patreon.com/Elton. Thank you. Elton Gar.